The Maricopa County election audit saga continues. So joining me today is Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. He holds 4 degrees from MIT and is also a world-renowned systems scientist, inventor, entrepreneur, perhaps best known for inventing email, but most recently garnering attention for his involvement in the election audit there in Maricopa County. Thanks for joining me on KLIM.news. What's the latest with this? Because it seems like an ongoing saga.
Well, the latest is that, on September 24th, just to review, is when I presented my findings from analyzing the images of the early voting ballot envelopes, right? The return envelopes. We presented that on September 24th. And then after that, the Attorney General has asked us to submit some more evidence, which we're frankly doing today. So it's going to move to the Attorney General, who appears to want to conduct an investigation. So remember, the ruling of something being fraud, quote unquote fraud, is not what the Senate does, right? The Senate and the House in Arizona pass laws, but it is the Enforcement Division, which is the Attorney General's office, which is the one that's going to decide if something's fraud, if people need to be, prosecuted, et cetera. So that's where it's moving to, and we've been asked to provide some more evidence for that. So that's what the status is.
But what I found interesting in reading up on this is you say you didn't even vote for Donald Trump in 2020, and that this is just to follow the books, to follow the rule of law that we have in place.
Yeah, in fact, I critique Trump. First of all, I've never been ever voted in the electoral process, even though I've been a U.S. citizen since 1981. Never voted because I didn't believe in the left-right narrative. I was an activist. I mean, I put that into one of the documents I wrote. I've been a ground activist, organizing people to, did the anti-war protests, organized food service workers while I was a student at MIT, expose corruption in academia. So I've been a fighter, but I never believed in the two-party system. The first time I ever voted was because Trump's rhetoric and his, uncompromising attack was what inspired me. But during his presidency and after, I had some serious issues. Nothing happened to Hillary, for example, right? We did Operation Warp Speed, in spite of the many communications we had with the White House about Fauci. He did say to tell some of these very, close supporters that he'd walk with them to the Capitol, and then he drove off, and people got killed. And in fact, the people who did get locked up were his supporters. So I brought up these contradictions, not in any malevolent way, but to state that you have to address the fact that if you're going to go after the establishment, you can't really compromise, and you have to surround yourself with those people who actually want to go, do the right thing. And I don't think that occurred in those 4 years. In my view, what occurred was that we allowed, various parts of the establishment to actually get even stronger. And that's why Biden was able to come in and execute all the vaccine mandates and those things. So I've been critical. That's why I didn't vote in 2020, but I did vote in 2016. And as a scientist and as an engineer, my intention is to always find what the truth is. And the systems approach is the way you do it. Every Monday evenings, we started a whole way of teaching people this. If people go to truthfreedomhealth.com, we have now 60,000 people all over the world who are recognizing, not only in the United States, but we need to go beyond this left-right paradigm. So there's an approach to train people on this, and it's called an engineering systems approach, where you start looking at the world as a system. There's a science to it. And that's why when you look at these election systems, it's not left or right. There's an engineering process here. And if the election officials in this country were the ones who ran, let's say, the airport systems, we'd have planes falling out of the sky probably every other day, because they don't really have to follow a process. It's all very squishy and arbitrary.
To that end, there is a system, and there's actually laws on the books to protect the vote, to protect people's vote. Many that seem unaware of the right to do an audit. Did you want to talk about that? Because we've heard a lot of people say, oh, just even questioning our vote is un-American. Did you want to speak on that?
Yeah, so one of the things, I was scheduled to speak at the House, and they had someone else go, which was fine. But when most of these congressmen do not even know the law, The law 52 USC 20701, which was passed around 50 years ago, by the way, by a Democratic majority, was to encourage audits. 52 USC 20701 says the 22 months after an election is when Americans are encouraged to audit things, encouraged to bring up questions, encouraged to bring up anomalies. That is what the law was set for. So when this guy, Ro Khanna, was asking the question, that it was un-American to essentially run an audit, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a Yale, I think he's a Yale Juris Doctor. So he's sort of either dumb or he basically doesn't understand the law, or both. But the reality is that the laws on the books are to encourage every American citizen to bring up anomalies like we did in our audits, small or large, insignificant or monumental. Because when you bring up anomalies, I run a couple of companies. When customers call us saying, hey, our technology is not working, we don't say you're a conspiracy theorist. We don't say you're an anti-vaxxer. You don't want to call them names. We say, thank you. We'll go look into it. Some of it may be stupid. Some of it may be right on target. Sometimes it's something really small that leads to a larger problem, which we go solve. In business, you have to solve these problems, otherwise you're going to be out of business. But these guys, these unelected officials, many of them who they are, think that they can violate engineering principles, which is when someone reports something, it is your job to have a culture of embracing it, thanking people, and going and finding out what it is and transparently answering it. So 52 USC 20701 was set up to support that engineering process.
Now, speaking of calling names, I know that you've endured a lot of personal attacks, but then I found it interesting that in your response to some of those personal attacks, you threw out that some people are being racist, which got a little bit of heat in and of itself. Do you want to expand on that or explain that?
Yeah, it's very important to discuss racism. You say for far too long, the left has had an hegemony on the discussion of race. So let me explain my definition of racism, which is really the accurate definition. You see, what happened is that the right, the Republicans, deny racism exists, all right? So that has created a vacuum for the left to own racism. And so their definition of racism is very narrow. For example, if you use the N-word or if you oppose affirmative action, you must be a racist. You following what I'm saying? So they have engineered it that they have bounded racism into a very, very small box. So there is a racism. And the real racism is this, is putting people into a box and saying, if you are black, then you must talk this way, speak this way, and be like this. If you are from a white person from the South, you must obviously hate black people, right? If you're an Indian, you must be moving your head from right to left and support Gandhi and not be an aggressive person and not expose corruption, for example. You see? So they put people into these boxes. And putting people into those boxes, what I call a segregationist box, is the real racism. And the racism occurs specifically when people step out of that box. So I'll give you an example. When I was at MIT, when I came there in 1981, I was on the front page for, a note was there that I had created the first email system, and then I didn't think much about it, never promoted it. Won a bunch of awards at MIT, was on the front page of MIT when I won my Fulbright, starting the first email management company, and many other things. But when my materials from the invention of email went into the White House, went into the Smithsonian, it created a quote unquote controversy. There is no controversy. Now, it created that controversy because I didn't invent email while at MIT. I invented it before I came to MIT in the ghettos of Newark, New Jersey, in a small medical college in the center of Newark, New Jersey. So the reality was that all great innovations must come from this bastion of technology, MIT, and surely couldn't come from somewhere else. You see, I stepped out of the box. So in this case, we want to call out the quote unquote lefties, the liberal elites, for their racism, because a guy like me, in their mind, and this is their real racist, a brown-skinned Indian guy who's highly educated, has all these degrees, is accomplished, is supposed to be a liberal Democrat. And I surely should not be doing an audit, right, that may expose the liberal elites that they may have done some malfeasance. So Ro Khanna, if you know that congressman, he fits into that nice box. He's a quote unquote a good Indian. but I'm not being a good Indian. And that's really the subtext of these attacks when they try to brand me as a conspiracy theorist, when they try to say he's an anti-vaxxer. You try to brand people and you ignore the fact that they did go through the American dream, did work hard, and got all those accomplishments on their own. And that's what they want to deny. You see, so if I had gotten all those accomplishments and didn't do election fraud analysis with all the skills I've gotten, then I'd be a good Indian.
Mm.
But that's really the subtext here. And so we need to have a discourse on racism in America, because the right wing and the Republicans have done a grave harm here by saying it doesn't exist. So it's created this unfortunate vacuum for the left to own it. And I'm saying that someone like me who has actually endured real racism and sees racism in a very different way, you know, we'll talk about this. Yes, you are racist when you brand a guy who worked extremely hard, earned all of his degrees, is a Fulbright scholar, has, done his accomplishments, and you try to just narrowly, when you lead with that statement and the way they brand you, that's saying we're going to lynch you publicly, quote unquote, lynch you because you've stepped out of your box. That is a racism. So I want people to raise their consciousness to recognize that the liberal elites in most of these liberal institutions who talk about racism are the real racists, because they want people to be in their nice little boxes, and they actually want to separate people. If you go to many of these universities, you'll find out there's 100, 300 different little clubs. There's the African Americans Club, right? There's a Black Students Union. There's the Afro Students Union. There's a Latin Students Union. There's a Cubans. I mean, they've created a little club for every ethnic group, right? Now, and they support that through funds and federal funds. So if you truly cared about bringing people together, why are you creating so many different little boxes for everyone? So that's the real racism. So there is a racism. So that's why in that attack, I said this is not only misinformation and disinformation, in my case, but it's a racist smear campaign. And I wanted to educate people on racism. And it was fascinating when they said, he's crying racism. It's fascinating because typically the right will state that. So here's the left, when I'm calling them out on the real racism, getting upset at that, when they are the real racists.
And to that end, before we move on from this subject, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because you've said, I'm not Republican, I'm not Democrat, I actually don't like the two-party system. I've actually said the same thing multiple times. I don't identify as either, I truly don't. But when it seems like whenever you are not with the narrative, with what is accepted by the media, they label you as right-wing or Republican. And we've even seen longtime classic liberals like Glenn Greenwald, who is a homosexual classic liberal, all of a sudden being called right-wing. We've seen Brett Weinstein being called a right-wing. So what is going on with, if you're not Democrat, you're all of a sudden all the way over to the other side? What's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do is we say you need to go beyond left and right. What's happened is it's neoliberalism. Okay, that's been taught in most of the large institutions. And look, Noam Chomsky used to be a mentor of mine. Okay, and I disagree with Noam on many, many things because he's become blindsided to this neoliberalism, even though he attacks neoliberalism. Because what's happened is the most of the university elites have fashioned what they believe to be the right way of doing stuff. And the right way of doing stuff is that the academic institutions are the ones that know best, right? We know better. Freedom should be suppressed under certain conditions, right? It's good to suppress certain kinds of knowledge. And so they've essentially gone against essentially the scientific method. So because once you do that, you can now start branding people, because now you become frankly unscientific. So the process has been, first of all, what we discovered in my lawsuit in Massachusetts was we discovered the censorship infrastructure. And that means you basically define what is acceptable discourse, and what's unacceptable discourse. So first you contain freedom. And once you contain freedom, you can contain debate, and discourse, which means you can contain what is truth. And so what we've done is we don't practice a scientific method, which is you throw out a bunch of ideas, you have to validate it in the marketplace of ideas. So once you limit that, you go to what's called scientific consensus now. And that is how academia has become. A bunch of people say, yes, the sun goes around the earth. Yep, that's true. Doesn't matter that you have evidence that's false, right? Yes, CO2 is what we need to lower, and that'll save the world environment. Yes, everyone needs to get the same jab, and then you're going to be cured of all types of immune issues, right? So we've created this very reductionist view, and this has come as a result of the scientific method being annihilated, which resulted from freedom, from censorship being enforced. And all of this started at the major elite institutions. And the reason this happened is because of fundamentally capital flow. So if you look at any of these areas, be it big pharma, right? Be it education, be it any of these things, there's immense amount of capital involved, and they need to control certain narratives so they can sell, frankly, a product. They can monopolize ultimately a product or a service. So it's ultimately related to money.
And I want to get more into that in a minute, but I wanted to get back to the election thing. This isn't the first time you've come into election issues. Didn't you have your own personal lawsuit with election integrity when you ran for federal Senate?
Yeah, I would say that it is our work in Massachusetts, which then dovetailed to the work we did for the Trump election, which really started, frankly, a lot of the movement here for the real movement for election integrity. The movement for election integrity has been typically, again, owned by the left for 20, 30 years, and they've essentially destroyed it. So we were the new kids on the block, and it was personally what occurred to me in Massachusetts. We ran for office as a Republican in the Massachusetts GOP, which is a highly, highly corrupt organization. We had 3,000 volunteers on the ground, 20,000 lawn signs, 10,000 bumper stickers. We raised $2 million, which is a lot for a primary. And the Massachusetts GOP ran a person against us who no one even knew. So the word on the street was we won that by a landslide. I mean, you couldn't get around Massachusetts without knowing who Dr. Shiva was. So when the results came in on September 1st, 2020, it turns out in the primarily hand-counted county, Franklin County, we won by 10 points. And in every other county that was machine counted, we lose 60-40, 60-40, 60-40, 60-40 to a guy no one even knew. He didn't even have any lawn signs out there, no campaign. So that's when I realized that something seriously wrong is going on in this country. That began my journey to using all the engineering skills I have to understand the voting systems. We filed our lawsuit where we found out that my votes were flipped. We showed that mathematically, but then more importantly, what occurred was when I started sharing this on social media, I had close to 360,000 Twitter followers. We exposed that the state election director of Massachusetts in a series of email conversations, she's admitting that she deleted ballot images, which are the images of the ballots. And she said, we don't have to save them by Massachusetts law. I said, that's false because 52 U.S.C. 20701 for a federal election demands that you save them for 22 months. So those email conversations I shared on social media, essentially implicating her of criminal violation. She then contacted Twitter to what we discovered later in my lawsuit was a Twitter partnership. The governments of every government, local and state government, have a partnership with Twitter, which is what our lawsuit uncovered. And they used that partnership to silence a U.S. Senate candidate. Think about what I'm saying. Political speech is the highest form of protection. We moved our campaign to the general election as a write-in campaign. I was still a bona fide candidate. And the state election director of Massachusetts contacted Twitter through their portal, through their VIP portal, to shut down a U.S. Senate candidate. Well, we got all the terms of our TRO, went into a full-blown lawsuit. Twitter was brought into the lawsuit. The judge had me bring Twitter. And by the way, I filed a lawsuit all by myself. No swamp lawyer in Massachusetts wanted to take it on. So it was me against 7 lawyers. On May 20th, in that lawsuit, we discovered what are called the playbooks, which if people go to winbackfreedom.com, they can find those playbooks, documents which show that the government has created a recipe, a user's manual for how state and local officials will silence anyone, any American, who even says that they are corrupt, okay? So we exposed that in court. The judge was freaked out. He said this lawsuit will be taught in every constitutional law class. And then he's the one who recommended a lawyer. And, 7 weeks into this, we found out the lawyer who we got did not want to go after the RICO conspiracy we discovered. He just wanted me to go back on Twitter and walk on my way. But we discovered so much through those playbooks and the long fuse report, which was done at Stanford, which showed that I was being surveilled since 2020, along with 5 other people, including Trump, Breitbart, Gateway Pundit, James O'Keefe, and one other person. So it got too hot even for the judge to handle. And the judge sealed our lawsuit. That's what happened. And we didn't want to just be on Twitter. And we said, forget that. I'm not going to give you guys the victory to say you put me back on Twitter and therefore everything resolved. I said, I'm walking away. But we are going to expose a larger issue that we don't have the First Amendment in this country. It's gone. And Tucker Carlson didn't talk about it. In fact, Glenn Greenwald didn't talk about it. So it's almost as though there are sort of the grifter people who are now recognizing that they need to go beyond left and right. Tucker Carlson is one of the most awful people in this because he's part of the not so obvious establishment. Tucker watches which way the wind blows. He's too little, too late. In fact, this whole thing with the vaccine issue, when you really look at it, I was the first one from a scientific basis to expose Fauci, and the guy's a complete charlatan. He has been around through administration after administration, and the reality is, when you look at it from a scientific approach, my PhD's in biological engineering. The guy knows nothing about the immune system. In fact, all the policies that we're enforcing are based on a 100-year-old model of the immune system. In 2019, I was asked to give the lecture at the National Science Foundation, an invited lecture on the modern theory of the immune system. And everyone knows that your immune system is very complex. But the bottom line is what's happened is, with the suppression of discourse, we now control science. So it's scientific consensus versus the scientific method. And that's why when you annihilate freedom, when you annihilate science, you don't really know what's good for your health. And when you have unhealthy people, they don't have the strength to fight for freedom. That's why, the movement that we've created now, it's a global movement, truth, freedom, health. Our slogan is beyond left and right. But every Monday evenings, we train people to really understand a systems approach. There is a nuclear physics, there's a science to understanding how to build movements. And that science is what needs to be taught. Otherwise, people are going to be grifting all day.
So my question is you've had the success of bringing evidence, you've dug deep, you've been able to bring it forward, you've even won many lawsuits. How do you not get discouraged? Because from the outside, what's it mean? Because nothing's changing. Are we ever going to see anybody held accountable? So what, in essence, what good is the evidence?
Good question. Yeah, Kristi, the bottom line is this, that no change is going to come from the legal system. The fundamental change, when you go at the fundamentals of what's going on with the censorship infrastructure we uncovered in our lawsuit, when you go at the fundamentals of election malfeasance that we've uncovered, when you go at the fundamental of the scientific establishment no longer serving science, we're going down to root cause issues. And if you go back to history, root cause issues were never solved by lawsuits. They were never solved by legislation. They were solved by something much more fundamental: people's movements, actual, and to be specific, working people's movements. In the 1800s, in 1886, 4 American workers were shot for basically fighting, not shot, they were hanged because they fought for the 8-hour workday in Haymarket, Chicago. Workers all over the world commemorated that as May Day. It was not a communist holiday. It was truly a commemoration of the American working class. By late 1800s, early 1900s, there was what was called a great upheaval. And by the mid 1900s, that upheaval is what put a gun to the head of the establishment, Democrats and Republicans, and they built infrastructure in this country. That's when we eliminated child labor. That's when we started doing nutrition. That's when we started building water systems and infrastructure. So it has been movements beyond left and right, beyond black and white, working people uniting that has always created change. The Southwest airline workers striking, the construction workers in Australia who spit on their own unions and broke from them. That's where real change is going to happen. It's not going to occur through elections because the system is too swampy, it's too deep, and it'll take way too long. It's going to occur through people's bottoms-up movements. When working people strike, when nurses don't Look, if the transportation workers in the United States, only 15% are controlled by the Teamsters. The other 85% are small business owners, truckers. When they strike, that's power. And that's the kind of movement we need, because the issues we're dealing with are no longer little tweaks to the situation. We're dealing with fundamental issues of the scientific method has been obliterated. We're dealing with the fundamental issue that the First Amendment has been obliterated. It's gone. And then we're dealing with the fundamental issue that health is not based on getting healthy. As long as you can profit from people's unhealth, we're never going to solve health. Pharmaceutical companies have been losing money for the last decade. Pfizer lost $25 billion. Their model of drug development is medieval. They need vaccines. It's actually much more simpler than any of the conspiracy stuff. Pharma's losing money. They're losing a lot of money. Pharmaceutical process is highly regulated. You can get sued. Vaccines, thank you to Ted Kennedy and the Kennedys. They're not, you can't sue pharmaceutical companies. A vaccine is a biologic. It doesn't need to go as much training. 17% growth per year. Pharmaceutical drugs, $1 in investment, they're only getting 1.8 cents back. So they're not making money from pharmaceutical drugs. So they have to move to vaccines and these new modes where they're not regulated and you can't sue them.
And then as far as what's happening and seeing these things obliterated, I will say that the other side seems to have been much more organized and much more passionate, and to the point that it seems like the other side that's fighting for freedom is just constantly scrambling and playing whack-a-mole, is what I feel like I'm doing all the time, even in my local government system. So how do we get organized when I feel like we're already 5 steps behind the organization and methods that the other side has been using?
Well, the way we move forward is people need to go to the physics. I spent 50 years understanding systems theory. I grew up in India when I was young, which had the caste system. So you're looking at a person who's a systems scientist and has loved political theory. So it was about 5-10 years ago, I put all this together into a curriculum to help teach people how do we build a movement. Movements are not just going to happen, Kristi. Oppression oppresses. It's not like you oppress people enough, the world's going to change. It's not how it works. There is a physics, there is a science. I may send you this video, or I may play it right now if you want, but there is a science to building a movement. And that science is the physics of how to build a movement, and it comes from system science. So to all of your viewers, they should go to truthfreedomhealth.com and sign up, because I used to teach this course at MIT. I've taught it all over the world, but we've congealed this course to teach people that the principles that run your body as a system are the same principles that run this computer as a system, that run election voting systems as a system, that run the world. And when people understand that, those concepts, which I figured out how to educate people in less than about an hour, then people can have the foundational ideas on how to build a movement. So what we've done is we've actually created that curriculum. We have now 60,000 people all over the world who've been trained, and we're creating leaders all over the world. But the idea is we need to create a bottoms-up movement that goes beyond left and right. And that movement has to be founded on recognizing that the way the world changes is working people. People who make things, people who produce things, people who take care of others. When those people organize and recognize that the power is in them, that's how the world changes. I mean, come on, legislation, lobbyists in the United States, the judges are bought and paid for. Do you really think anything foundational is going to happen on the foundational issues of our time? No way. We're fooling ourselves.
To that end, bringing it full circle, what is your prediction of what's going to happen with what you found in Maricopa County? Will anything be done about it? Will the Attorney General do anything about it? And will we see anything be done in any other state coming out of this?
Well, look, tomorrow, October 14th, I'm holding an open forum. I, do what I do to help advance the knowledge of people. That's what came out of the Maricopa audit. The anomalies we found is moving to the Attorney General. I'm not sure of all the dynamics there, so it's hard for me to predict that. That's out of my control. But I will be here to give as much evidence as they need. But what I can do, and what you can do, and everyone listening, is that we can go direct to people and educate people. On what we've done through the community that we're building is we've done these little cards and flyers, Kristi, that people can print out. We educate people. So we have people going on the ground, neighbor to neighbor, educating people. I'll be doing this forum tomorrow, inviting people independently. So we need to build independent movements with the right education, because we don't know what politicians will do, right? That's out of our hands. There's too many forces there. But let me tell you this, you going and speaking to 10 neighbors with the right basis of understanding systems beyond left and right, you can have a tremendous amount of impact. And my view is if we get about 50,000 people worldwide understanding the science of systems and going beyond left or right and becoming educators, that's how the world is going to change. You need a certain number of people who are highly conscious of these issues, who are willing to move beyond Republican and Democrat and left and right. I don't mean to be independents. I mean truly understanding on every one of these issues the physics here. If you take any one of these issues, masks, the jabs, racism, workers' wages, every one of those issues has been split into a dialectic: pro-mask, anti-mask, right? Pro-vax, anti-vax, right? Pro-racism, I believe racism exists. Racism doesn't exist. Pro-union, anti-union. So the establishment has created these dialectics. But if you go beyond that, you find out on any one of these issues is the actual problem that everyone can agree to. So for example, mask and anti-mask, or vax and anti-vax. You can argue with people, and I have my position, but ultimately everyone cares about public health, right? We all want public health. Then the issue comes, once you identify the real problem, you have to ask, does masks and vaccines get us to public health? Well, when you really study history, you find out we got to public health through infrastructure. Go back to the 1900s. It was water systems. It was nutrition. It was eliminating child labor. Massachusetts has an F minus in infrastructure for the American Society of Civil Engineers. The United States has a D. So you go to schools, they don't even have the proper ventilation systems. So you're telling people to wear masks and do all this other stuff when you don't even when the infrastructure in the United States is completely decaying. And if you really want to solve public health, why don't you go do that? But you can't do that because your politicians are all corrupt. So how do you actually get infrastructure? It's going to come through a movement. So like this, every one of these issues we can trace to the real problem and the real solution and get beyond what I call the dialectic of left and right or pro or anti.
I think
it's going to come through education.
Yeah, I think there's so many people that really speaks to, because whether they are on one side or the other, they see that this is a problem, that there even is just only two sides that they demand we pick from. So I'm definitely going to be including links to.
You should take the course.
Yeah, I'm
Please join
you're speaking to me right now, so I'm
everyone
interested.
should go to truthfreedomhealth.com. We made it really accessible. I used to charge thousands for this. We've made it like nothing for people to come in and take it. But all of that infrastructure we're putting into our educational infrastructure. My great-grandfather was an indentured servant, a slave. He had no money, but if someone in the village came to him and asked him for a book, he would figure out some way to get them a book. It's education. Ignorance is a cause of all suffering, and that's where we're at. We are at this point in history because we have been drawn into outsourcing our civic responsibilities to politicians and billionaires and celebrities. And they're not going to do anything. They have golden handcuffs. All right? It's only going to happen when you understand the physics of how the world operates. So we've made that accessible, and people start getting educated and they start becoming catalysts. We don't need leaders. We don't need followers. We need educators and catalysts now to educate people on how to go beyond left and right. There's no other way change is going to come. We're just going to be going through the Republican pendulum, then the Democrat pendulum, and we're going to go back and forth. We're all going to be misused and abused. The American worker right now, 25% of Americans are out of jobs. Very important. The average American has maybe $400 in their bank account, 80% of Americans. In the last 40 years, the unions, the real workers' movements have been destroyed. During 1940 to 1980, there were 11 million strikes in the United States, and nearly 100 million people participated. And during that time, the American economy grew for everyone, because when we fought, we got our rights. During 1980 to today, because the left and the right collaborated and they destroyed the real spirit of unions, there is no workers' movement. There was only maybe 900 strikes in the last 40 years, and then maybe only 2 million workers participated. And now we have two American pies. One American pie for the Jeff Bezoses and the 5% or the 0.5%, and the other for the other working Americans, which are shrinking. Over the last, since 1950, $50,000, $50 to $70,000 has been transferred from working people to the elites. So yeah, there's been socialism for the elites. So all of this, the jab, the censorship, the mask mandates, this is part of a long process of control. It's about controlling working people. And the American worker is the tip of the spear of the real movement because they had the First Amendment and they still have the Second Amendment. So we're witnessing here is absolutely brutal control of people. It has frankly nothing to do with vaccines and masks. It has to do with the fact that those are instruments of control.
Absolutely, and I think that's a phenomenal way to end this interview is with those thoughts. I think a lot of people can relate no matter what side they are on, with just the real divide being the elite and the working class, period.
Working people unite. What we say in the slogan is beyond left and right, beyond black and white, truth, freedom, and health, working people unite. That's the only way changes come. No other way significant changes ever come. Politicians always come later. They jump on the bandwagon afterwards, when they see that they may be out of business. They will never lead anything.